He was once the strongest man in Cotton Creek, a rancher no one dared cross. But one accident stole his sight and shattered his world. For months, Caleb Whitmore sat alone, lost in anger, a ghost inside his own home, until a woman he barely knew, plain, steady, unnoticed by most, walked into his broken life without fear and refused to leave. She didn't try to fix him. She simply stood beside him. Stitch by stitch, day by day, she taught him how to live again. Not through sight, but through heart. And when Caleb finally reached out his hand, he found something stronger than all he'd lost. Caleb Whitmore had been the kind of man folks tipped their hats to when he passed. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that carried the sun and storms of 1,000 rides across Cotton Creek. His dark blonde hair had long since faded to a soft sand color at the temples, but his blue eyes still burned with a stubborn fire, the kind that built empires out of dust. He owned more land than anyone for 3 counties wide, and more cattle than any hand could count in a single day. His word was law on the range, and for years he had lived like nothing and no one could ever touch him. But pride has a way of planting seeds you can't always see. The accident came on a spring morning so bright it hurt to look at. A new stallion, wild, unpredictable, had broken free from its pen. Caleb, never one to ask for help, strode in to tame it himself. One misstep, one kick, a flash of pain like lightning through his skull. And then, nothing. No more sky, no more sun, no more horizon rolling out like a promise in every direction. The town said he was lucky to be alive. Caleb didn't feel lucky. He felt hollow, crippled. In a matter of seconds, he had gone from king of the prairie to a prisoner inside his own mind. Back at the ranch, the grand old Whitmore house stood silent. The halls that once echoed with boots and laughter now filled only with the creak of empty floorboards and the cold, metallic clink of Caleb's cane tapping from wall to wall. He refused visitors. He turned away old friends. The staff stayed at a distance, whispering behind hands, pity thick in the air like smoke after a fire. "Whitmore's finished," they muttered. "Man like that, he ain't built to be blind." And they weren't wrong. Each day, Caleb sat alone by the great front window, facing the open plains he could no longer see. Rage curdled inside him. Rage at the doctors who could do nothing, at the men who now spoke his name with pity instead of fear, and most of all at himself, a man who had built an empire with his bare hands, reduced to fumbling for a coffee cup he could no longer find. Outside, the seasons shifted. Winter thawed into a green and riotous spring. But inside the Whitmore ranch, time froze. Caleb existed like a relic, a ghost in his own life, the legend everyone remembered but no one dared disturb. Until the day Grace Bennett knocked on the door. The knock at the great oak door echoed through the empty halls like a sound from another lifetime. Caleb didn't move. He sat in his worn leather chair, his cane propped uselessly against the armrest, jaw tight, the muscles in his neck rigid with the stubborn pride that had been his armor for so long. Another knock. Then the creak of the door as Amos, the old ranch hand, shuffled in. His voice, hesitant but carrying that undercurrent of stubborn country loyalty, drifted across the room. "Mr. Whitmore, there's a girl asking to see you." Caleb's mouth twisted into a bitter sneer. Another charity case, no doubt. Another bleeding heart sent by the pastor, thinking pity could fix what was broken. "Send her away," he barked, without turning his head. But the door didn't close. Soft footsteps crossed the threshold. Not loud, not insistent, just steady. a presence more felt than seen.
"I'm not here for charity,"
a woman's voice said, low, calm, unshaken. "I'm here to work." Caleb stiffened. His fingers curled into fists against the arms of the chair. The nerve, the gall to walk into his house and speak to him like he was some crippled child needing a nursemaid. "And who in the hell are you supposed to be?" he snapped. There was a brief pause, then the voice answered without fear, without false gentleness. "Grace Bennett. I work at the church kitchen. I clean houses sometimes. I was told you might need a hand. Not pity, just hands." Her words hung in the stale air, so different from the syrupy kindness that usually poured from the mouths of do-gooders who came calling. Caleb turned his head slightly, toward the sound of her voice. He saw only darkness, of course, but something about the way she spoke, plain, rooted, without varnish, stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. He muttered something that might have been a curse, or might have been permission. Grace took it for the latter. She crossed the room without waiting for an invitation, the hem of her plain brown dress brushing softly against the wooden floorboards. No perfume, no rustle of fancy silk, just the faint scent of fresh soap and clean linen. Standing a few feet away, she didn't offer her hand. She didn't make a speech. She simply said, "Where do you want me to start?" For the first time in weeks, Caleb felt a thread of uncertainty tug at the heavy curtain of his rage. He didn't answer right away. Part of him wanted to throw her out, drive her away with the same cruelty he had sharpened like a blade against everyone who tried to reach him. But another part, the part buried so deep he barely remembered it existed, held him back. Grace waited, patient as a stone in a river. Finally, in a voice so low it was almost a growl, Caleb muttered, "Start by shutting the damn door. I'm tired of the cold." Without a word, Grace did exactly that. The door swung shut with a soft click, sealing them inside together. Two strangers, bound by silent wounds, neither was ready to speak of yet. Outside, the wind stirred the prairie grasses, bending them low, but never breaking them. The days that followed were hard, harder than Grace could have prepared for. Caleb was like a wounded bear, all teeth and fury, lashing out at anything that came close. Every word she spoke was met with a scoff. Every suggestion earned a cold sneer. If she placed his coffee 2 inches off the usual spot, he'd knock it to the floor and curse. "You think I need some charity case babysitting me?" he barked one morning after she gently offered her arm to guide him outside. "I think you need someone to remind you you're still alive," Grace answered, her voice even, her face betraying nothing. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't pity. It was simply truth. And somehow that stung worse than any softness would have. The other ranch hands avoided the house now, treating it like a cursed place. The once proud Whitmore Ranch, reduced to whispers behind cupped hands. Grace heard the murmurs whenever she went into town for supplies. Shame about Caleb. Such a strong man, brought so low. Should have sold the ranch when he had the chance. But she never listened to the voices. Her loyalty wasn't born from what Caleb had been, or even who he was now. It was born from something deeper, a recognition of brokenness, the way a cracked mirror recognizes another crack without judgment. Each day she kept coming back. She dusted the unused rooms. She aired out the halls heavy with silence. She filled the house again with the small, stubborn sounds of life, a broom against wood, the clink of dishes, the low hum of a hymn as she worked. At first, Caleb met it all with silent resistance. He sat brooding by the cold fireplace, unmoving, unbending, his fingers tapping out restless, angry rhythms on the arms of his chair. But even stone wears down under steady rain. One evening, after another bitter silence stretched too long, Caleb knocked his water glass off the table by mistake. It hit the floor and shattered, sending sharp pieces spinning across the worn rug. Caleb stiffened. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles in his neck trembled. His breathing grew ragged with fury, but not at Grace, not even at the world, at himself, at the humiliation of reaching for something simple and finding only emptiness. Grace didn't gasp. She didn't rush to pick up the shards like some flustered nurse. She simply crouched beside him, her movements calm and deliberate, gathering the broken pieces with steady hands. "You can be angry," she said softly, not looking up. "You have every right to be." The words hung in the heavy room, raw and unexpected. Then she added, still in that same simple voice, "But being angry won't teach you how to live again." For a long time, Caleb said nothing. His fists unclenched slowly, trembling from the strain. His face, always so guarded, so fierce, cracked just a little, like a dry riverbed giving way to the first trickle of spring water. Grace rose, gathered the broken glass into an old rag, and carried it away without another word, leaving Caleb alone with a silence that, for the first time in months, didn't feel entirely empty. Somewhere deep inside him, a wall had shifted. Not fallen, not yet, but shifted. And that was how change always began. Spring bloomed slowly over Cotton Creek that year, like a shy child peeking out from behind a door. The prairie grasses unfurled in tender greens, the rivers swelled with snowmelt, and the world outside the Whitmore Ranch stirred with life. Inside the great house, something even more delicate was unfolding, something no one could see, and perhaps only one of them could feel. Grace Bennett never pushed Caleb. She never ordered, never begged. She simply offered. Small chances, small choices. A seat on the porch instead of his worn leather chair. A walk to the corral fence. A hand resting lightly on his arm, never pulling, only guiding, when he hesitated. At first, Caleb refused every offer with a grunt or a grimace. He clung to his bitterness the way a drowning man clings to the wreckage of a ship, hating it, but too afraid to let it go. But Grace was as patient as prairie rain, falling soft and steady no matter how hard the ground resisted. One morning, when the air smelled of thawing earth and sweet budding flowers, she found Caleb sitting rigid in his chair, his hands knotted into fists on his lap. She spoke without pity, without urgency. "It's a fine day out," she said. "You could sit and scowl at it from the porch just as easy as from in here." A long silence. Then, a grunt that might have been agreement. It took a painful effort for Caleb to rise, to trust the hand she offered. Not to lead him like a child, but to walk beside him like an equal. Step by step, they crossed the threshold together, and Caleb's boots hit the wooden boards of the porch with a thunk that seemed to shake something loose inside him. He sat heavily in the old rocking chair, facing nothingness but feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, the breath of the wind across the fields, the distant calls of meadowlarks hidden in the tall grass. "What do you see?" he asked hoarsely, surprising them both. Grace didn't hesitate. She spoke quietly, weaving the world around him in colors he could no longer claim with his eyes. "I see sky the color of fresh-washed denim," she said. "I see the river throwing diamonds when the sun hits it just right. I see grass thick enough to lose a horse in, and wildflowers fighting their way up like they don't know they're small." Caleb sat very still, the words painting pictures across the blank canvas of his mind. His fingers twitched slightly, brushing against the coarse fabric of his trousers as if trying to feel what he could no longer see. "You don't have to stop seeing," Grace added, her voice soft but sure. "You just have to learn a different way." It was not sympathy. It was not instruction, it was a gift, offered without demand. For the first time since the accident, Caleb let himself lean back in the chair, the old wood creaking under his weight, and simply breathe. He could feel the world again, the sting of sunlight on his skin, the taste of dust and grass on the wind, the sturdy heartbeat of the ranch pulsing all around him. Not with his eyes, not anymore, but with something deeper, something he hadn't known how to trust until now. Grace sat beside him, her own hands folded in her lap, saying nothing more. She didn't need to. Some walls don't fall with a crash. Some simply weather down, one quiet day at a time. The days stretched longer, golden and slow, and something unseen but powerful began to knit itself back together inside Caleb Whitmore. He still stumbled sometimes, still cursed when the world didn't bend to his blind reach. But there was less venom now, less despair. Grace was always there, not hovering, not pressing, just present, like the earth underfoot, steady and certain. One afternoon, the kind where the air hummed with lazy bees and distant river song, Grace guided Caleb to a wooden bench under a sprawling cottonwood tree. It was the first time he had ventured beyond the porch since the accident. The grass brushed against their boots. The sun draped them in soft warmth. Birds called in the distance, and the scent of new wildflowers colored the breeze. Without a word, Grace bent down and plucked a small, stubborn flower growing near the bench. Nothing showy, nothing grand. Just a scrappy little thing with purple petals and a bent stem. She placed it gently into Caleb's rough, calloused hand. "It's a wild violet," she said. "Small, ordinary. Folks step on them without thinking." Caleb turned the stem carefully between his fingers, feeling the fragile texture of the petals, the tiny imperfections in the leaves. His thumb brushed the bloom's delicate face, and something twisted sharply in his chest, something raw and unfamiliar. "It's not much to look at," Grace added, her voice low, almost a whisper. "But sometimes the plainest things carry the sweetest scent." For a moment, Caleb couldn't speak. He felt as if the world had cracked open around him, pouring colors and smells and textures into a place he'd thought forever sealed shut. All his life, he had measured worth by what could be seen: the sleek shine of a prize horse, the sweep of his endless lands, the sharpness of a woman's smile at a dance hall. But what Grace had given him was something different, something no riches, no victories had ever taught him. Worth wasn't in what dazzled the eye. It was in what endured quietly when no one bothered to notice. He pressed the little flower close to his heart, gripping it as if it were a lifeline. For the first time since the darkness took his sight, Caleb smiled, not the bitter, broken twist of his mouth he had worn like armor, but a real smile, warm and human and new. He turned his face slightly toward Grace's voice, the scent of the violet rising between them. "You see things better than anyone I've ever known," he said hoarsely. Grace just smiled, small, steady, and sure, and together they sat in the afternoon light, two souls stitched back into the living world by nothing more than patience, kindness, and the fragile strength of a flower no one else would have noticed. The change inside Caleb was real, but the world beyond the ranch hadn't changed with him, and Cotton Creek had never been kind to weakness. Rumors still floated like dust through the town, that Caleb Whitmore was a broken man, that the great Whitmore ranch would be sold off piece by piece before summer's end. The vultures were circling. It was early evening when the storm hit. Not a storm of rain, but of betrayal. Amos, the old ranch hand Caleb had trusted for 15 years, stood in the wide front room with a worn hat twisting between his calloused fingers. His voice was low, slippery with false kindness. "Boss," Amos said, "ain't no shame in letting go. Sell the place now while you still can. Folks'll pay fair. You can live easy. No need to fight it." Across the room, Grace stood silent, her hands still from folding linens. She didn't speak, didn't move. She simply watched Caleb, watched the muscles tense along his jaw, the way his hand tightened into a white-knuckled fist against the arm of the chair. There was a long, terrible silence. Then Caleb rose to his feet. Slowly, deliberately. No hand reached out to steady him. Grace knew better. This was his battle. The room held its breath as Caleb stood tall, his blind eyes hidden behind the hard lines of his face, his posture as straight and proud as it had ever been. "You think I can't hear it?" he said, his voice low and graveled. "The way you whisper, the way you wait for me to fall so you can pick my bones clean?" Amos swallowed but said nothing. "I may not see you," Caleb continued, "but I can smell the stink of cowardice a mile off. Always could. Still can." Every word hit like a hammer blow. Not shouted, not barked, spoken with the quiet, unbreakable certainty of a man who knew exactly who he was, even if the rest of the world had forgotten. "You want to leave?" Caleb finished. "Then go, and don't let the door hit you on the way out." Amos hesitated only a heartbeat, then turned and fled, his boots scraping hard against the floor. The door slammed behind him, rattling the old glass. The house fell silent again. Caleb stood there, breathing hard, the muscles in his shoulders trembling, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of holding everything inside. Grace stepped forward then, not to steady him, not to fuss, but to be near, just near. Her presence, a quiet lighthouse in the storm. "You didn't need me to fight for you," she said softly. "You just needed someone to believe you still could." Caleb's mouth twisted, not in a grimace this time, but in something closer to a smile, weary but real. Outside, the evening sun dipped low over the ranch, setting the fields ablaze in gold. Inside, for the first time in a long time, Caleb Whitmore stood not as a broken man, but as a man who had found his strength again, even in the dark. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind of rhythm that stitched broken things back together without anyone noticing at first. Caleb was different now, not cured, not magically restored, but awake. He moved through the ranch with a new kind of authority, tapping his cane with certainty, barking out orders when needed, listening harder than he ever had when he could see. The men who stayed, the ones who hadn't abandoned him, learned quickly that the man behind the blindness was still very much Caleb Whitmore. And always, just a few steps away, there was Grace. Not leading, not pulling, simply walking beside him. It was on a late summer evening, under the endless Cotton Creek sky, that something shifted again. Something deeper. They sat outside on the porch, as they often did now, Grace knitting slowly, Caleb listening to the wind stir the grasses. The smell of rain hung on the air, heavy and rich. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote cried out, a thin, lonely sound that twisted the heart. Caleb shifted in his chair. He cleared his throat once, twice, an uncertain sound from a man who had once commanded rooms with a glance. "Grace," he said finally, voice roughened by more than just disuse. She set down her knitting carefully, turning her full attention to him. Caleb's fingers fumbled for a moment, then found hers. Strong, steady, warm. He gripped them like a lifeline, grounding himself against what he needed to say. "Everyone else," he began, struggling for words he had never needed before. "They saw what I lost." He paused, breathing hard, feeling the truth claw its way free. "You." His voice cracked, raw and unvarnished. "You saw what I still had?" Grace's eyes shimmered in the fading light, but she said nothing. She knew better than to interrupt this moment, this laborious birth of truth from a man who had built his life on silence and pride. "You didn't pity me," Caleb said, the words rough but certain now. "You didn't treat me like a dead man still walking." He lifted her hand gently, pressing it over his heart, where the slow, steady thud spoke of a man not defeated, but remade. "You taught me how to live," he said simply. Grace let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her fingers trembled slightly against his chest, feeling the fierce, living beat beneath them. "You did the hard part," she whispered. "No," Caleb said, shaking his head, a faint, worn smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You made me want to." The words settled between them, heavy and pure, more binding than any vow spoken before an altar. In the distance, thunder rolled low across the plains, promising rain, the kind that soaked deep into the earth and made things grow again, stronger than before. Grace leaned her head lightly against Caleb's shoulder, and he tilted his face up to the sky he could no longer see. But somehow, in this moment, could feel more clearly than ever. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. The world had changed again. Not with a crash, but with a whisper. They married in the soft light of a September afternoon when the sky stretched wide and endless above the Cotton Creek fields and the prairie grass danced golden in the warm breeze. There was no grand church, no polished brass band, just a handful of neighbors, the ones who had stayed loyal, gathered beneath the cottonwood tree where Caleb and Grace had shared so many silent afternoons. Grace wore a simple dress of soft cream linen, stitched by her own careful hands, with a crown of wildflowers, violets and daisies, woven through her loose braid. Her face, plain to those who valued only surface beauty, radiated something far more lasting: quiet strength, kindness, and the kind of gentle light that could guide a man home in the dark. Caleb stood tall beside her, dressed in a black jacket that smelled faintly of saddle leather and wood smoke. His cane rested against the tree trunk. He didn't need it now, not for this. His hand found hers with perfect certainty, their fingers intertwining like two branches grown together by wind and time. When the pastor asked the blessing, Caleb did not bow his head. He lifted his face to the wind and smiled. Because for the first time since the accident, he felt nothing missing. He was whole. He was home. As the words were spoken, simple words, honest and clear, the gathered few wiped at their eyes, not from sadness, but from the deep, quiet beauty of watching two broken souls find each other and make something unshakable from their scars. Afterward, they didn't host a grand feast. They served coffee and slices of Grace's best apple pie, sitting together at a long, rough-hewn table under the wide sky. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just laughter, clinking cups, and the warmth of a community that had once doubted Caleb, and now saw him not as the blind rancher to pity, but as a man reborn. Later, as twilight fell in a soft lavender hush over the plains, Caleb and Grace sat alone on the old porch. The wild violet Caleb had once held trembled in a small jar between them, its bent stem still stubbornly upright, just like them. "You gave me back more than my life," Caleb said, his voice low, speaking only for her. "You gave me a world worth living for." Grace smiled, resting her head against his shoulder, a gesture not of need, but of absolute trust. "You found it yourself," she whispered. "I just walked beside you." The night deepened around them, soft and sure. The fields stretched out forever, unseen, but fully known. And for the first time in a long, long while, Caleb Whitmore didn't mourn what he had lost. He marveled at everything he had found.